people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Former unified lightweight champion Teofimo Lopez took to his social media and stated, "They just said we'll make everyone else undisputed at this point to defeat the purpose, LOL. Just remember, I brought that trend back. Hashtag the takeover.
Teofimo, you were never undisputed, bro.
And even if I run with the idea that Teofimo was, in fact, his division's undisputed champion, he didn't start that.
He didn't.
Both Alexander Usyk and Terence Crawford became undisputed champions at their weights before Teofimo. Teofimo Lopez tenuously became his division's undisputed champion in October of 2020 when he took on Vasyl Lomachenko. I say tenuously because his undisputed status was the subject of many disputes.
But hey, if you want to qualify it, qualify it.
If you believe that Teofimo Lopez was in fact an undisputed champion at one point.
Reality is, even if he wasn't the first to do that. He didn't get it started.
He didn't. 2 years prior to Teofimo Lopez versus Vasyl Lomachenko in July of 2018, Alexander Usyk became the cruiserweight division's undisputed champion.
That was 2 years before Lopez fought Lomachenko.
3 years before Lopez fought Lomachenko in August of 2017. 3 years before that, Terence Crawford became the junior welterweight division's undisputed champion.
Teofimo Lopez didn't start that trend.
Didn't start in October of 2020 when he fought Vasyl Lomachenko and tenuously became his division's undisputed champion, even though the whole time it was the subject of many disputes.
Which makes you wonder if he was ever really undisputed.
It's neither here nor there because he's not in possession of any of those alphabet titles or franchise designations anymore. They have changed hands. We all know who they went to. They went to George Kambosos Jr., who will be fighting for undisputed status in a matter of weeks against Heaven Daney.
Why does this feel like shade?
Is he talking about George and Devin? I really don't know. I don't get the sense that's who he had in mind when he made this tweet. I get the sense that he was talking about Jermell Charlo, who this past weekend became his division's undisputed champion at 154 pounds. I get the sense that that's who Teofimo had in mind, and I get the sense that this tweet harbors some resentment for those who are fulfilling the goal that he claims to have already fulfilled, becoming the lightweight division's undisputed champion, even though it was the subject of many disputes.
This doesn't fucking matter. He didn't start that trend.
Yeah, years before Teofimo's quote-unquote takeover in his alleged undisputed status, you saw Gennady Golovkin saying that he wanted to become his division's undisputed champion. And while he never did it, it was still something that he was shooting for. The same applies to Anthony Joshua. He was yet another guy, long before Teofimo rolled around, who said he wanted to become his division's undisputed champion. This is not a trend that Teofimo Lopez started, and that's what I'm getting at.
Delusional, man.
These delusions of grandeur communicate to me that Teofimo Lopez really isn't over that loss he suffered to George Kambosos. Psychologically, he's still back there.
And do you remember what he says? He feels that Matchroom and DAZN set him up.
A very hard conspiracy theory to reconcile because DAZN gained nothing out of trying to set up Teofimo Lopez in that George Kambosos fight, if that is in fact what happened, though for all of you who saw the fight, you'll know that was no setup.
No.
Teofimo was outfought. He was beaten fair and square by George Kambosos Jr., who surprised him. Surprised us all, really, because that was one of the bigger upsets in postmodern boxing.
Nobody set Teofimo Lopez up. He lost the fucking fight.
Simple as. And because I don't think this kid is in the right headspace right now, because I don't think he's over that, honest to God, I don't think he should be fighting. I don't think he should make a ring return until he's got his head on straight. And I don't know how long that's going to take, but what I do know is it's very dangerous for him to go out there if he's not in the right frame of mind. That's a kid who's been through a lot.
And I'm not downplaying that for comedic value.
Issues with the wife, now the ex-wife. losing all his alphabet titles so soon after winning them to George Kambosos Jr. in that shock upset loss.
Tumultuous family problems, home life.
You say that this kid's one win away from being right as rain and getting back in the winner's bracket. But he's got to actually win the fight in order to get there. And that may prove difficult to do, difficult to rebound, if he's not in the right headspace. And being honest, I don't think he is.
He's got nothing to be ashamed of. He lost the fight.
Happens to the best of them. Even if it was a shock upset loss, I don't think it was as big a shock as Anthony Joshua losing to Andy Ruiz in his Madison Square Garden debut, or as anywhere near as big a loss as Mike Tyson losing to Buster Douglas. That was a monumental, once-in-a-lifetime upset loss.
And yeah, losing to George Kambosos, that was a big upset in postmodern boxing, but it happens.
Last we heard from Teofimo Lopez, he was talking to Kate Abdo, and he said that they're pursuing an undisputed title fight with Josh Taylor. The problem is, Josh Taylor is no longer the 140-pound division's undisputed champion. The WBA title has gone vacant, and the WBA, in so many words, is holding what is tantamount to a essay contest.
They want 6 of their top 6 guys in their top 6 ranked standings to give them a 15-minute presentation on why they should get the fight for that belt.
Just chuck due process and fuck numerical rank standings, right? I mean, what's the point when you can sort the situation out that way? In any event, it seems that Teofimo Lopez's 2-time undisputed plans, as they were, they've hit a snag. If the goal was to fight Josh Taylor to become a 2-time undisputed champion, Josh Taylor's not an undisputed champion anymore.
And this tweet from Teofimo Lopez feels like shade.
Perhaps shade towards Jermell Charlo for very recently becoming an undisputed champion himself, that pantheon of fighters who went above and beyond to establish themselves as the best in show, the most dominant fighter at their weight. Perhaps that's who this shade is aimed towards, even though Teofimo didn't mention Jermell Charlo by name.
I mean, what the hell else could he be talking about?
There's only one guy that became an undisputed champion this past weekend, and that was Jermell Charlo. Is it a coincidence that this is what Teofimo Lopez is saying here and now? I don't think that kid's in the right headspace. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Chris Eubank Jr. on Kell Brook. Let's be honest here. You don't seem like the sharpest tool in the shed. Those few millions you've made, they're not going to last you more than 10 or 15 years. So come out of retirement and let's get this fight out of the way.
Is he seriously goading a now retired Kell Brook to come out of retirement to fight him?
There's just so much wrong with this. Where to begin? I mean, let's start with Kell Brook being a naturally smaller fighter. Small enough that he was last in action at a catch weight of 149 pounds, whereas Chris Eubank Jr. has fought as high as super middleweight. Why is he goading a now retired former welterweight champion?
Why doesn't he pick on somebody his own size?
Well, it's because if he does, he might lose. Listen, Chris Eubank Jr. is trying to ride the wave that Kell Brook created when he secured that big win, that big W, over his domestic rival, Amir King Khan. That's why Chris Eubank Jr. is goading him specifically, to come out of retirement. That in unison with the element of danger that awaits him should he continue to campaign as a middleweight.
He wants the most reward for the least risk.
He, like everybody else, knows that Kell Brook versus Amir Khan was a commercial success. It did well at the box office, it did well at the gate. And Chris Eubank Jr. aspires to capitalize off of that success by getting Kell Brook in the ring. The problem is Kell Brook's retired, and if I'm being honest, Kell Brook ain't no goddamn middleweight, but Chris Eubank Jr. is. Now, there are some other middleweights out there that Chris Eubank Jr. could look into fighting, should look into fighting, and one among them is Yanibek Alim Kanuli. Yanibek was going to be in action very soon against unbeaten Danny Dignam for WBO interim status by way of the middleweight division. That's a guy that Chris Eubank Jr. should be looking at, not a retired former welterweight champion.
You know why he's not looking at that guy.
It's not as simple as saying that Yanibek Alim Kanuli has no profile in the United Kingdom, because for what it's worth, he's already fought a couple of guys that ain't got no profile in the United Kingdom. He was okay fighting those guys. Why wouldn't he be okay fighting Yanibek Alim Kanuli? And it's simple. It's a high risk for a low reward. Yanibek Alim Kanuli, you know, he ain't...
Won't get past him as easily as you got past Marcus Morris.
Or Wanik Audajan. Yanibek Alim Kanuli is very much a high risk and a low reward. The story is that there were some preliminary conversations already to potentially do that fight.
Should Johnny Beck make it past Danny Dignam?
And I think he will. I think he's going to knock that guy out. But if that's the case, why is Chris Eubank Jr. here and now goading Kell Brook to come out of retirement? Well, he's got a preference. He'd prefer to take on the highest reward for the least risks with Kell Brook, because Kell Brook obviously has more marquee value in the United Kingdom, and Chris Eubank Jr.
Got more marquee value than Yanni Bekalim-Kanuli in the UK, and he's a naturally smaller guy.
Guy who's approaching the end, guy whose career is circling the drain. In many ways, it has gone down the drain as he has officially retired. He's not in the twilight years of his career. His career is over.
It's a shameless display.
It really is. You know, Chris Eubank Jr., he's never been a full-fledged champion. At any rate, he's never held an alphabet title with any of the major four alphabet organizations, WBC, the WBO, the WBA, and the IBF. The most that Chris Eubank Jr. has ever held is an IBO title that he
won from Reynald Quinlan.
The fuck is that?
Exactly.
Chris Eubank Jr., he's the apple that ended up falling far from the tree. Perhaps not as far as Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., though let's be honest,
honestly,
Chris Eubank Jr. hasn't taken the world by storm. The boxing world. For what it's worth, he's got some tools. Good-sized punch for a middleweight. Good engine. I've seldom ever seen him get tired. And he's a tough bastard. You know, he took a lot of punishment in that George Groves fight, but he finished the fight on his feet. He's got some ingredients, he's got some minerals, but he's missing something.
Missing a lot of situational awareness and tact from what I see.
You can never accuse Kell Brook of ducking the smoke with anybody. At any rate, really. He's the one who voluntarily made the decision to move up in weight and stand in for Chris Eubank Jr. against the boogeyman at that time, at the height of his powers, at the height of his popularity, Gennady Golovkin. That ass-whooping that Kell Brook took at the hands of Gennady, that was intended for Chris Eubank Jr.
It was a career-altering ass-whooping.
He ended up taking that ass-whooping because you couldn't find your pen. That's how all of that came into being. That's how all of that happened. The least you can do now is let the man retire in peace, because after he took that shellacking at the hands of Gennady, he went right back down to the welterweight division, a massive cut in weight, a weight he was already struggling to make, to take on yet another puncher in Errol Spence Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. has never really shown that kind of ambition, that kind of gusto. Oh, he's fought some fights, fought some decent fighters,
but I don't get the sense he's made out of the same stuff as Kell Brook.
Call out of a now retired former welterweight champion to move up in weight and take him on at middleweight. It's tactless and tacky, lacks situational awareness. What it lacks is dignity, because there are other fights out there, other guys at middleweight that he should be looking at, more than he's looking at Kell Brook.
I hope Kell Brook stays retired and don't give him the satisfaction.
You know what I hope? I hope that Chris Eubank Jr. is left with no other option but to challenge Yanni Bekalim-Kanuli for his WBO interim status, should he win it from Danny Dignam. It's about time that Chris Eubank Jr. knuckle up and fight somebody serious, because he hasn't in a long time.
I mean, Liam Williams was alright, but you know what I mean.
Finally, in men's welterweight news, Benn very recently said, the main fight that I want is Keith Thurman. Great fighter, but I believe I'd be too much for him.
Seems like everybody wants a piece of Keith Thurman.
Everybody but the guys that Keith Thurman claims to be targeting, Errol Spence Jr., Terrence Crawford. In many ways, those two boys, they've got bigger fish to fry. They've got each other. Whereas Keith seems to be on everybody's radar. Everybody else.
Yeah.
Everybody including Benn. I don't mind that fight, but I don't think it's realistic, because I don't see Keith Thurman crossing over to the Matchroom DAZN side of things for that fight. I don't see him taking a flight over there to the United Kingdom, where the fight will be worth...
Oh yeah, a fight like that's worth some money in the UK.
Can you really even fault Benn for calling out Keith Thurman at a time when Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., the only two champions at this weight, they're supposed to be preoccupied with each other. In theory, those two boys are supposed to fight later on this year.
Everybody can't just sit around waiting on them the way that Keith is.
Doesn't seem like that's what Connor's doing. In reference to Connor, Amir Khan had this to say. He said, in the UK, the next pay-per-view star, I think Benn could make it. I think Eddie Hearn's holding him back a bit too much. He's calling out all of these big names out. Myself, Kell Brook, we're done. He needs to go and prove himself, like when I went and fought Marcos Maidana.
Well, isn't that what he's doing by calling out Keith Thurman?
Keith Thurman only has one recorded loss, after all, the loss to Manny Pacquiao over 2 years ago.
He's a former unified champion.
And even if here today in 2022, he's not the exact same fighter that he used to be, even if his best days are behind him, he still only has one recorded loss. Wouldn't Keith Thurman be a step up in competition for Benn? A step up from the guys that Conor has been fighting. I mean, wouldn't that qualify as a step up in competition for Conor?
A step up in class.
The story is that Eddie Hearn has declared that they've now made an offer to Top Rank for Conor Benn versus Jose Ramirez, which is being discussed. The fight could potentially take place July 9th at the O2 Arena if a deal can be reached. I liked both of those fights. I like a Jose Ramirez fight. I like a Keith Thurman fight. I think the Jose Ramirez fight is a little bit more realistic.
Because Matchroom has done business with Jose Ramirez before.
In the past, Top Rank did let him cross over for that one-off fight, that unification match at 140 pounds with the then reigning WBO champion, Mighty Mo Hooker. They've done business in the past, more business than they've done with Keith Thurman, so I do view the Jose Ramirez fight as being somewhat more realistic than the Keith Thurman fight. Though I reiterate, I can't fault Conor Benn for calling out one of the somebodies at 147 pounds because, well, that's what he's supposed to do. What would people say if he were doing the opposite? If he were shying away from those kinds of fighters and expressed no interest in them?
You just can't win with some people.
Damned if you do, and damned if you don't. That's what they say. Though in truth, I don't expect to see Conor Benn take on Keith Thurman because I think Keith Thurman is quite content biding his time, waiting on his own side of the street for something to open up.
Keith Thurman's no stranger to the couch.
No stranger to long stints of inactivity. Just the other day I said for the likes of Terrence Crawford, Keith Thurman would be little more than a tune-up fight. And I was surprised to see somebody actually gave me some static, some resistance when it comes to that.
Keith Thurman still got 1 or 2 fans running around.
Looking at today's Keith Thurman with blinders on, this ain't the Keith Thurman of 2016 or 2017. Believe you me, I had a very different opinion of that fighter way back when. These days,
I'd pick both Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford to stop him.
Turn Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz.
And Montes Stanionis.
Now, against young Conor Benn, you could probably give Keith Thurman the edge in that fight, though because Keith Thurman has never really been all that durable, and he hasn't been all that active the last couple of years.
Well, he fought earlier this year.
Fought Mario Barrios, but before that, he hadn't seen any action since the Pacquiao fight, a 2.5-year stint of inactivity. All things considered,
If they could get that fight over the line, it's a very interesting fight.
they could. There is room for surprises in there because while Keith Thurman might be a better and more experienced boxer than young Conor Benn, he doesn't seem to be the same puncher that he used to be. Mario Barrios, who was stopped at 140 pounds by Gervonta Davis. Gervonta, who was moving up from 130 pounds.
Mario Barrios went the distance with Keith at welterweight, where he couldn't go the distance with Gervonta at junior welterweight.
Couldn't go the distance with Gervonta, but he could with Keith Thurman. I don't think Keith is the same puncher that he used to be. That creates a very interesting situation.
Keith's never been all that durable either.
Don't misunderstand me. You could still give Keith Thurman the edge to outpoint young Conor Benn. I mean, I think that's how the bookies would have it. I think Keith Thurman would go into such a fight as the favorite, but it's still interesting enough and intriguing enough that you want to see it, that it's a fight that's worth making.
It's unfortunate the amount of politics there are in the sport these days.
And how many fights don't come into fruition as a result? How many fighters are more comfortable biding their time doing nothing than expanding their horizons and broadening their overall audience? Keith is happy to sit around waiting on PBC Island.
I can't fault Conor for calling him out, but I do think he's barking up the wrong tree.
I don't mind the call out, but the fight itself, it won't happen.
Keith is not crossing over to the zone.